Hey everybody, Mr. Rogers here with our next lecture series for World History class, where we're going to be talking about fighting World War I. So what happened when World War I actually started to fight? How did it change world history? What were the battles like? What was it like to be a soldier on the front lines of World War I? What were some of the key moments? And how did the war end? Those are all things that we're going to go over in this lecture series. This is part one. In part one, we're going to go through sort of what at the beginning of the war and up to sort of the first couple of, not first couple, but the two major battles of the war that you need to know for this class and are sort of the most famous battles. And one of which we'll be doing for our checkpoint work. So you're going to want to focus very much on the Battle of the Somme, which we're going to get to a little bit in this part. And then part two, we'll look at how the war ended and its impact and how many people died in the war. All right, so we're going to jump right in then and start with reviewing what are the two sides of World War I. What are the two sides of World War I? We went into this with our direct causes of World War I slideshow and lecture series, and you can take a look at that for more details. But here are the two sides. On the left over here are the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. On the right are the Allied powers of France, Great Britain, and Russia. So we've got left over here is the Central Powers. Over here are the Allied powers. All right, so these are the big picture people who are duking it out in this world war. And I will just probably refer to them mostly as the Central Powers and the Allied powers. The Central Powers and the Allied powers. But there will be a few cases we'll be focused on specific countries, like Germany in particular, and France and Great Britain in particular. All right, so here's the beginning of the war. Germany is the first to attack, because Germany had a problem. At the beginning of the war, they would have to fight on two fronts, or two battlefields. In the east, they would have to fight against Russia, and in the west, they would have to fight against France. So they had to fight two enemies at the same time, which is really, really difficult for a country to do, even a country that's rich and powerful and has a great military like Germany. So when the war began, Germany had a plan to win the war very quickly by defeating France very quickly. So the goal here was to sort of knock France out right away, and so they could turn their attentions to fighting the Russians and fighting in the east. So this was known as the Schlieffen Plan, which is named after the German general who came up with it. And the goal of this was for Germany to take France by surprise through a trick. And this trick was invading France through neutral countries, countries that weren't participating in the war. So instead of attacking on the French and German border, which is what you're supposed to do in a war, you're supposed to attack through your territory, which is over here. This is the borderlands between France and Germany. The German plan was instead to invade through this neutral country of Belgium. And by invading through Belgium, they would hopefully catch the French off guard and be able to get around French defenses and smash them, win right away. And the goal of this plan, again, was to defeat France right away so Russia would be left alone and could easily be defeated by the Germans. So, again, this Schlieffen Plan was to knock France out of the war right away through kind of breaking the rules of war by invading through this neutral country of Belgium. Those of you who know anything about World War II, this should sound familiar. All right. Initial success was this plan that Germany had was initially very successful. At first, the German army was within days of the invasion. Germany was within 35 miles of Paris, which is the French capital. If you've heard of it, it's the capital of France, one of the most important cities in Europe, and obviously the most important city in France. And within just days after their invasion, they were within 35 miles. All right, so about the distance to Trenton from Philadelphia. It's about 35 miles. Really close. All right? However, despite their initial success, Germany faced new problems because they had been so successful at first. First, their soldiers were extremely exhausted. Fighting this quickly, fighting this rapidly, moving across so much territory so fast was really exhausting for the German soldiers. They were tired. They were beaten up. They had fought really, really hard, and they had done really, really well, but that had left them really, really tired and exhausted. Also, the French allies, the British, were starting to reinforce them. So France, which was knocked off guard, you've got the German army breathing down the neck of Paris. Things are looking horrible, but the British are now starting to reinforce the French, so the French are starting to get more soldiers to help hold off the Germans. And that leads to the French counterattacking Germany. So while initially, again, to review, Germany is initially successful, they run into some problems pretty quickly. All right, and this leads to a stalemate. All right? As stalemate. Because of French counterattacks, the Germans have to change their plan. And they moved from attacking France to defending Germany and defending their own positions. All right? And this gave the French the opportunity to defeat the Germans at a big battle in 1914 called the Battle of the Marne. All right? And this battle forced the Germans to retreat from Paris. So they were so close to winning the war, so close to taking over Paris, but they are defeated on September 14th, 1914 by the French and by the British in this huge battle. All right? Now, what this does is after this retreat, the Germans dig in big trenches, and in the response, the French dig in big trenches, and everything stalemates. Because both sides are really well defended, both sides have dug in. If you've ever seen any images of watched any World War I movies, this is the famous image of these, and we're going to talk way more about trenches in a little bit. This is the famous scenes of World War I, right? Big, deep trenches with bombs and guns firing over people basically living in these trenches, okay? So by the winter of 1914, both the French, the British, and the Germans had all dug in their sides and were prepared to just sit there and defend where they were. So we're at a stalemate by the end of the first year. And the thing is, though, this first year was extremely deadly. 300,000 French and German soldiers were killed, which is about the third the population of Philadelphia. So imagine in just a few months, from August to December 1914, 1/3 of the population of Philadelphia is killed. That's insane. The British Army was also reduced from 12,000 people who first showed up in France to just 2,000 within that first year. So this is extremely deadly, and despite the German initial success, things are stalemated. It doesn't look like either side is going to be able to win, despite the heavy casualties, despite the initial German success. And this ends up being called the Western Front. All right? After the winter of 1914, the armies of the Allied and Central Powers stared at each other across a huge line of trenches that spread all the way from the English Channel up here in the north to Switzerland in the mountains down over here. That's 6,250 miles. That's huge. Imagine, the entire country of France is basically cut in half by these trenches. That's a crazy experience with people, all right? And this trench warfare experience became the main thing that soldiers and people came to understand about fighting in World War I. This is where fighting in the trenches, or I'm in the trenches. That's where this saying comes from. Okay? That classic metaphor of someone being down in there, doing the hard work, suffering, it could be, in the streets or at work or whatever, being in the trenches, that comes from this war. Because it's the defining experience that everyone on the Allied side and on the Central Power side experienced. So how did trench warfare work? Well, the frontline trenches were about 6 to 8 feet deep and about 35 yards to a mile apart, with support and communications trenches dug behind them. All right, and you can see this sort of image of what one of these frontline trenches looked like, as over here on the right. All right, sandbags and barbed wire protected the trenches from attack. All right, the trenches did protect soldiers from gunfire, but not direct artillery fire. So it was really hard for you to get shot by enemy gunfire, but you could still have bombs and cannons fired on you. So there was some safety in these trenches, but if they really wanted to bomb the heck out of your position, the enemy could do that. And in many ways, that was the frequent way in which fighting happened, was these long artillery or cannon exchanges between the different sides. All right, what was it like to live in these trenches? All right, when there was no fighting, life in the trenches could be really boring. And there was not actually that much fighting because it was really hard to attack the other side because of all this barbed wire, all these trenches. Everybody's ready for you to attack. This is not something where it's not a very dynamic situation. It's a stalemate. It's not changing a lot. So most of the time, it was extremely boring for soldiers. And conditions in the trenches were generally awful and miserable. Examples of these bad things that happened were, first, constant fear of attack or bombardment. At any moment, the enemy could just open fire on you, could start raining death on you, and that's horrific. You also had lice, mice, huge number of giant, enormous, starving rats that would attack people, like that could eat at your toes and your fingers. All right, it was just horrible. There was stagnant water, so if it rained, the trenches would flood because there was no drainage. It's just a trench. They just dug a trench. There's no drainage. And cold winds would blow through the trenches. All right? And death was everywhere, not just from enemy fire, but also from these horrible conditions. You have people's fingers and toes being eaten by rats, people dying of disease. So you have these lice-bitten, rat-infested people who are constantly afraid of attack and getting blown up. All right, what was it like to fight, though? Trench warfare obviously favors the defending side. If you're attacking a trench, you're in way more trouble than you're the person who's in the trench. All right? So generally how a battle would work is the attacking armies would start a battle with artillery bombardment that could last for hours or even days. The goal was to soften the other side's defenses. So let's say the French wanted to attack the Germans. They would open fire with big cannons, artillery, and just bomb. Again, sometimes for days, they would bomb the other side. Okay? And this was the goal of this was to soften up the defenses of the opposing side. Now, after this bombardment, men from the attacking side would go over the trenches and attack. But the problem was, men often got stuck in the holes that were created by their own cannons. Men got trapped in opposing barbed wire. And men often had walked into opposing machine gun fire, which just mowed them down, man after man after man. Because remember, you're up and charging, and everybody's waiting for you with their gun to shoot you. And if they have a machine gun, they can shoot multiple people at once. They can just mow down you and all your friends because you've got to charge over the hill towards the trench. Battles centered on then what's called a no man's land. Again, this is where the term no man's land, which I'm sure you've heard of before, comes from. This no man's land that sits in between the different sets of trenches. All right? And this no man's land was open to fire from both sides. So the French could fire on the no man's land and the German could fire on the no man's land. So everybody had a clear shot. And dying men were often left screaming and crying in this no man's land because their comrades could not save them. So say the French, they attack the Germans and they get pushed back. The Germans just are like, you can't get us. There's a bunch of dying French soldiers in the middle of this no man's land because they can't go and rescue their friends who are dying because the Germans will just shoot them dead. And the same is true when the Germans attack the French. This is horrific warfare. Horrific warfare. And because of how horrific this is, it leads to new ways of fighting. And both sides, French and Germans, and British, Russians, Ottomans, Austrians, they're all looking for new ways to fight, to get around these problems. And the first one they come up with is this thing called chemical weapons, which is known as mustard gas. And you can see people wearing these gas masks that you may have also seen before. All right? These are chemical weapons. They are fired into the trenches to try to blow out people and kill them and clear out the trenches. And these chemical weapons were horrific. They burn out your lungs and they blow straight through the trenches. Because remember, if we go back a couple slides, I talked about how we got down here, cold wind was blowing through these trenches. Well, now this cold wind is blowing gas, poisonous gas, through the trenches, burning out people's lungs. Another weapon that's invented in this time started uses flamethrowers. Because imagine, you get close to somebody in a trench, you turn on that flamethrower, you're going to be able to burn them to death. Or if you've got people, again, in that no man's land charging forward, you've got your flamethrower, you're all ready to just mow them down with fire. It's, again, horrific war. Then airplanes get started to be used for the first time, where they can drop bombs on trenches. So we start seeing airplanes be used for the first time because they had just been invented within like the last 10 years. And they're getting dropped on trenches to get around this trench warfare. And then tanks were also invented during World War I to overwhelm the trenches. And the tanks are immune to gunfire. They're immune to flamethrowers. All right? And so they're able to just run over trenches. All right? So now we're going to look at two battles to highlight all of these aspects of trench warfare that I just talked about. Once we're done with these two battles, that will be the end of part 1 of our lesson on fighting World War I. And then part 2, we'll look about how the war came to an end. All right. The first battle we're going to look at, both battles we're going to look at are in 1916. Okay? And both sides wanted to, in 1916, they've been fighting for 2 years. Both sides, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers, wanted to launch big attacks to try to win the war. They've been fighting for 2 years. Millions of men are dying. Their economies are ruined. Everything is just horrific and horrible. And both sides, both the Central Powers and the Allied Powers, are looking to break the stalemate and get a big victory for themselves. And so there are two huge battles fought this year. The first is the Battle of Verdun, which was a German attack on the British and the French, and the Battle of the Somme, which is a British attack on the Germans. So these are the two battles that we're going to look at. In the Battle of the Somme, we're going to be looking at for one of our checkpoint work. So this is going to inform directly the checkpoint that we do. All right. So what's going on in the Battle of Verdun? All right. Germany's goal here was to launch a massive attack on French forces to try to inflict huge casualties. Germany wanted to bleed France white, which means that to get them to surrender, that by losing millions of men, France would just not be able to fight anymore. Germany wanted to kill 5 Frenchmen for every 2 Germans killed. And what they do, starting in February 21st, 1916, is they launch a giant attack on a French region known as the Verdun. All right? France decided to hold that region at all costs. They understood that if they lost here, that it would cripple their morale and that they would not be able to recover. So both sides are fully committed to fighting it out, starting in late winter 1916. All right. Now, here we go. The French managed to hold off the German attack. But this came at a massive loss of life. 540,000 French men died. That's half the population of Philadelphia of 1 million. 540,000 Frenchmen died. 90,000 were killed in one part of the battle known as Dead Man's Hill alone. So a fifth of all people killed, just under a fifth, of all people killed in this battle were killed in one place. The Germans were not much better off. 430,000 Germans are dead. This is huge. You can see over here is a picture over here of the aftermath of the war. Or not the war, of the battle. Now, despite these huge losses, again, remember, over 500,000 Frenchmen are dead. The Allies want to launch their own attack as response to what happens at the Battle of Verdun. And that's going to lead us to the Battle of the Somme. And the British launched their attack along the River Somme on July 1st of that year of 1916. The attack was a disaster from the beginning. All right, it was a gigantic disaster. The British found the German barbed wire was too tough to cut through. This left British soldiers trapped in the no man's land under heavy German fire. Thousands died within minutes. Thousands of people died within minutes. For example, one Canadian regiment lost 658 out of 752 people in 40 minutes. Think about that. At the end of the first day, 60,000 British soldiers, that includes people from not just England or Scotland, but also from Canada, from India, from South Africa, they were all fighting. Anyone who was part of the British Empire was fighting in this war on the British side as well. 60,000 British soldiers were dead. And this battle lasts from July to November. Now, the most the Germans retreated was a few miles, and most of the gains that the British could say were in yards. Yards! Less than a football field. The death toll for this battle was huge. 420,000 British were dead, 200,000 French, 650,000 Germans. In the first day of the battle alone, more British soldiers were killed than Americans were killed in World War I, which we're talking about, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War on the first day. Think about that. More British died in one day of this battle than died in the entirety of World War I on the American side, the entirety of the Korean War on the American side, and the entirety of the Vietnam War on the American side. Crazy. So many people are being butchered in this war and being butchered in these battles. All right, so this is where we're going to leave off. We're going to next talk about how World War I was an example of total war, and it builds on what we talked about here for part 2, and we're going to talk about how the war ended. Okay, so make sure that you're checking your study questions and you check what I discussed here against your study questions. Make sure, of course, when you're on your study questions that you create your own copy of the study questions so that you can answer them. And make sure you check out part 2 of this video and find out how the war ended and how World War I is an example of what historians call total war. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy.